Hey comrades, today we bring you another batch of Soviet horror stories. If you enjoy the video, don't forget to like and subscribe. Now sit back and enjoy. This story began in summer when our entire group of friends went camping and fishing at Lake Seliger. An unreal beauty, the air, the sun, the shimmering water inviting you to take a dip. By day we went out in the boat, fished and cooked fish soup. At night, around the campfire, it was the ideal time to chat. We discussed everything, obviously, whether Misha had gotten married and his mother-in-law was a dragon, whether Vavan had bought a car, and right then and there, we would spend a couple of hours debating the national automotive industry. Slava, and how did you finish with the renovation? Misha asked one of our friends, who was unusually quiet today. We knew that Slavka had recently bought a flat for next to nothing and was fixing it up. No way, boys. A renovation is never finished. It's only abandoned. One thing pops up, then another, he replied with a smile. I think I have a couple of months left. Oh yeah? And in general, how is it? The neighbors, the area, everything good? The neighbors are quiet. There's an old couple who seem very religious. They spend their time crossing themselves every time they see me. On the other half, there's an empty flat, and in the other one, some new Russians have started renovating. The only annoying thing is that the kids are playing pranks often, those brats. Kids? Yeah, I suppose it's the neighborhood children. They ring the intercom in the early hours of the morning. The building where Slavka had managed to buy the flat was old, from before the war. 2 stories, with arched windows and walls a meter thick bound with egg mortar. They don't build like that anymore. The first 2 weeks, Slavka spent his time taking old junk out to the trash. Mountains of religious literature, amulets, crosses. They said the previous owner was a madman whom they found in mid-February, frozen in the middle of the room, with the windows wide open to the street. Surely, many potential buyers didn't like that story, and that's why the price kept dropping and dropping. But what did Slavka care? He didn't believe in ghosts and, in general, distrusted any mystical nonsense. Finally, he left the walls bare and the bare minimum of furniture. He put up new wallpaper, bought a sofa, and moved in to finish the details as he went along. He brought his belongings and had the housewarming party. The first few nights he slept like a log. He didn't hear anything, but about a week later, he was awakened by the beep of the intercom. He looked at the clock. 3 in the morning. What kind of joke was this? It must be said that the intercom was one of the few things that had surprised Slavka in that house. A brand new device with an outdoor camera and a small screen. Expensive. They said it had been installed by the previous owner, a terrible paranoid, who feared receiving certain visits. In any case, Slavik looks at the screen and sees nothing. Only mosquitoes and moths flying around the light of the street lamppost. Just in case, he pressed the talk button and asked, "Who is it?" There was no answer. On the intercom, a kind of static and clicks could be heard. In the background, far away, the barking of a dog and the sound of a train. A common and ordinary summer night. Slavka sent everything to hell and went back to sleep. The next day, the episode was forgotten between work and the daily hustle and bustle. He didn't have time to think about it. So the following night, he didn't immediately understand what had woken him up. The intercom was beeping again. Slavka picked up the phone, still half asleep. Who thinks of disturbing at this hour? In response, once again, only the singing of the night crickets and the static on the device. From then on, the calls began to repeat, almost every night, sometimes several times in a row, always in the range of 2 to 4 in the morning. Slavka had already shouted through the intercom, had run out into the street and had even called the maintenance service technician. All to no avail. "I'm telling you, it's the kids who are bored," he finished his tale. We discussed it, laughed for a while, and forgot about the subject. We weren't in the mood for scary stories in the middle of summer. Being on vacation and being young, however. Now, I think that if we had taken his story seriously at that moment, everything could have been different. Summer ended and autumn arrived. The nights became cold and long. For several nights in a row, Slavka slept peacefully. No one touched the intercom, and he came to think that the pranksters had grown tired, but nothing could be further from the truth. The next call arrived at the most inopportune moment. Slavik was with his girlfriend, Lika. "Damned kids," he muttered as he approached the device. This time, the click sounded as if they were closer, and a slight interference ran across the screen. Slavka sharpened his hearing. He thought he could distinguish a whisper among the static. "Stop bothering, you piece of idiots," he roared through the intercom and returned to the sofa. From then on, the calls became daily again, and the interference increased. By day and in the afternoon, the intercom worked perfectly, and the technician insisted that the device was not broken, nor did it have any short circuit. A couple of times the calls occurred while he was with people. Lika heard them, but couldn't distinguish anything more than static. Once, Misha witnessed the scene when he stayed to sleep at Slavka's house after a fight with his wife. The first snowfall fell in early November. Slavka returned home late when all the neighbors were already inside. The path to the entrance of the building was covered in snow, and his footprints were the only ones breaking the whiteness. However, upon reaching the door, Slavka stopped and almost dropped his shopping bag. Near the entrance, there were other prints. Small prints of a child's bare feet on the snow, right beneath the intercom. He looked around and made sure that the prints didn't go anywhere, as if a barefoot child had appeared out of nowhere, had been trampling around there for a bit, and had disappeared. Slavka went up to the second floor, 3 steps at a time, locked himself in the flat, and drank half a glass of vodka in one gulp. A horrible chill ran down his spine, and he wasn't a fearful guy. After thinking it over, he managed to calm down. Well, the footprints must be another sick joke. Maybe someone is taking revenge on me. An ex, what do I know? Just in case, he turned off the intercom and went to sleep. But in the middle of the night, the sound of the device woke him up. Slavka was afraid to go near and look, but he made an effort. On the screen there was only heavy interference, but it seemed to him that something was moving inside there. On the handset, an incomprehensible whisper could be heard, and suddenly they began to sing a song with a very thin child's voice, distorted by the static. His hair stood on end. Slavka threw down the phone and ripped the wires out of the intercom. However, just before the device gave a final beep and shut off, on the screen one could clearly see, for a second, the face of a girl, extremely pale, with sunken eyes and heavy, dark circles around them. Slavka ran out to the kitchen. He drank the vodka straight from the bottle, and it goes without saying that he didn't feel the burn of the alcohol. He had more terror than ever in his life. During the rest of the night, with great difficulty until dawn broke, Slavik went running to the clinic to see a psychiatrist. The doctor listened to him, prescribed some medications, and advised him to sleep more, get some fresh air, and not eat a heavy dinner. And if the intercom irritated him so much, to simply dismantle it. Enthusiastic about the idea, Slavka went running back home. He grabbed a hammer and set upon the damned device with blows until he broke the reinforced casing. He couldn't rip the box from the wall, but he cut all the wires, even the one going to the handset. leaving part of the components strewn on the floor. Towards night, it began to snow, and the temperature rose a bit. Slavik didn't last long, sleeping waiting for the call. But the destroyed device remained silent. Towards dawn, sleep overcame him, and he woke up at noon, considerably calmer. The thaw lasted a few days. A lot of snow fell, and then the cold returned. Winter settled into the city. One gelid morning, Slavka crossed paths on the stairs with the neighbor, one of those religious fanatics. With solemnity, she handed him a church candle, a paper holy card, and a cross. "Pray, young man. God is merciful. He will hear you. Pray." Slavka didn't get into an argument with the woman. He accepted what she gave him, thanked her, threw everything in the car, and forgot about the matter. At night, upon returning home, he saw a girl next to the entrance of the building. She looked like a girl. She had long, tangled hair, frozen like a steak. She was blue from the cold and almost completely naked. Only a dirty and disheveled diaper barely covered her body. The girl slowly pressed the buttons of the intercom. But the device didn't ring because it was broken, and no one answered. Perhaps she thought the owners weren't there. Nearby, a dog began to bark furiously. Slavka turned his head towards the sound by reflex, and when he looked back, the girl was no longer there. With stiff legs, Slavka ran inside the building. It took him a lot of effort to hit the lock with the key. He felt that the girl was standing right behind him. The neighbor's door opened a tiny bit, and the woman who had given him the candle in the morning peered out. "What, have you seen her?" "Woohoo!" Slavik's voice faltered out of fear. "Katia, have you seen her?" Evidently, Slavka's trembling appearance left no room for doubt, because the woman opened the door wide, inviting him inside. "Come in." Slavka obeyed and went to the kitchen, which was full of children's clothes hanging. It smelled of soup and cat. "Don't make noise. You're going to wake the children." The neighbor put the kettle on the stove and stood still, looking at her guest. "I'm going to tell you who Katia is. Listen, before, in the Soviet era, these flats were built for academics. My father received this one in his day, and in your flat lived a family of scientists. With a young daughter, Sveta was her name. She was a very spoiled girl. She had everything. Imported clothes, toys, those Barbie dolls, God forgive me. So she grew up without knowing what it was to have a hard time. She was beautiful, but she knew nothing about life. Barely had she turned 18, God took her parents. They were killed in a car accident. Sveta at first cried and was in mourning, but then she felt freedom and went astray. Wild parties, gangs, drinking binges. She dropped out of college, spent all her parents' savings, started selling the things from the house. We tried to talk to her, to set limits, but she had only one answer, that she was of age and did what she wanted. And well, from so much partying around, she got pregnant by who knows whom. At first it seemed she was correcting herself. She calmed down a bit, started working as a cleaner in a nursery school, and we helped her in whatever we could. She had a girl in November, named her Katia, but after New Year, a little boyfriend appeared for Sveta. It seems they didn't drink or cause scandals, but one day we ran into Sveta on the stairs. Sunken eyes, her arms full of bruises, the withdrawal. The guy had gotten her into drugs, and once again, the lack of control started in that house. Strange, silent people went, who hid themselves. At that time, I worked as a nurse in the hospital, doing 24-hour shifts. I was returning from work, and I see a strange bundle next to the entrance. I touched it, and it was Katia, 3 months old, completely frozen. She was crying. She bothered them for their wild parties. They took her out for a minute and forgot to bring her back in. The neighbor's deliberate voice trembled. The kettle on the stove began to whistle. The woman poured boiling water into Slavika's cup. The clock on the wall moved forward. ticking past 12:30 at night. They took both of them away. I don't know if to a rehabilitation center or to prison. We didn't see Sveta or the guy again. The flat took a long time to sell, and that winter we started hearing. At night, the crying of a baby downstairs at the entrance door. We thought it was our imaginations. Then spring arrived, and it seemed everything calmed down. But the following winter, the baby returned to cry. Only now it sounded older, and my neighbor from below, Aunt Zena, saw a toddler of about 2 years old crawling next to the door. A year later, I saw her myself. Do you believe it's the ghost of the dead baby? It's madness. Slavka couldn't swallow the tea. I know it's madness, but it's her, Katia. I held her in my arms. I fed her. Each year she returns a bit older and more clever, and she always wants to enter her house. At first, she couldn't open the doors, but in recent years she already walked up the stairs. Then we put coded locks, and she calmed down a bit. She only cried below and scratched the door until she learned to open it. The neighbor sighed. We already brought the priest, blessed the house. But the apparition keeps coming. This year she turned 7. The one who lived before you was terrified of her. That's why he installed that intercom just for himself, because we manage with a key. And Katia, it looks like she liked the toy. Now she rings your bell every night. Slavka didn't remember how he returned to his flat. The neighbor had told him to be careful, not to open up for anyone, but he couldn't process it. He sat in the room with the light on and stared at the destroyed intercom. The call rang past 3 in the morning. Slavka approached. On the broken screen ran static, total interference, but a silhouette could clearly be distinguished moving. In the cut handset, slight crackles were heard, the sound of a distant siren, dogs barking. Then the sound seemed to stifle, as if heard through a thick veil, leaving only the static and a halting whisper. "Let me in," distinguished Slavic, frozen with terror. "Let me into the house. I'm cold. Go away," he roared with a suddenly hoarse voice, trying to shake off the vision or simply chase away the fear. The crackles ceased. The screen turned off. Slavic exhaled a sigh and prepared to go put his head under the shower. But he hadn't reached the bathroom when the beep of the intercom rang again. He stayed sitting in the bathroom until dawn, thinking what to do. He couldn't tell his friends, let alone a girl. They would send him straight to the madhouse. Slavka decided to try to rid himself of Katia on his own. He resorted to priests, candles, amulets, folk magic, and to blocking the door with a heavy chest of drawers. By that time he had already put the flat up for sale, and almost every night, from the broken device, came that trembling whisper that chilled you to the bone. "Let me in, I'm very cold." The siege continued until February, until the great snowstorms. That day a terrible blizzard blew. Gigantic snowdrifts formed. Cars could barely advance through the covered streets. Soon spring is going to arrive and everything is going to melt, he thought. Slavic hurried to reach home early, set up the barricade, turned the TV on to full volume, and let Katia ring all she wanted if she liked it so much. But he didn't realize that the snow had gotten into the track of the building's entrance door, causing it not to close entirely well against the frame. Near 3 in the morning, Slavic woke up suddenly and sat up in bed. It seemed to him that the intercom had beeped, but not like when they call. Rather, the sound of when someone inputs the correct code to enter. Slavka looked at the door blocked, with the chest of drawers, then at the TV. They were showing a movie. The intercom's screen flickered and showed the typical static, which suddenly disappeared to give way to the bloodshot eyes of the girl. Slavic felt something scratching the door of his flat, and then a plaintive and low whisper was heard. "Let me in. I'm right behind the door. I'm cold. Let me in." He began to pace around the flat in panic, shouting at her to go away and leave him in peace. Slavka even thought about throwing himself out the window. He opened it wide, but a crack behind his back left him petrified. As if in slow motion, he saw how the entrance door was slowly opening, pushing the chest of drawers, and how through the opening peeked the frozen hands of the girl stretching towards him. "Warm me, I'm so cold." In the morning they found Slavka dead, with a clinical picture of severe hypothermia. The window of the room was wide open, and during the night, a tremendous block of snow had gathered inside the room. Lika confirmed that in recent times, Slavik was behaving very strangely. Furthermore, the visit to the psychiatrist made his madness manifest. They say that flat is up for sale again. They did renovations on it and fixed the intercom. It seems they are asking next to nothing for it. Haven't you heard? Many universities, and not only the Siberian ones, have their own field bases for students' summer practicals. In each of these bases, there always lives permanent staff, watchmen, storekeepers, cleaning staff. In summer, they hire and bring from the university all the necessary personnel to feed the horde of students and professors. In winter, the bases are rarely abandoned completely, but they dispense with most of the staff, leaving a watchman, or, to give it more status, a technical director of the premises. The task of this technical director is to look after the cabins so that tourists don't burn them down, something that had already happened, and to look after the few implements that remain: mattresses, bed bases, sheets, and other details. At the base of one of the large universities of Western Siberia worked a local man of about 50 years old. He didn't live in the village, but at the base itself, about 7 kilometers from the village, in a watchman's cabin that the university had given him. And he managed a very simple economy. In winter he hunted, and the university authorities sometimes used the base as a rest center. On those days, Uncle Vanya lent skis to those who arrived, taught how to glide to those who didn't know, and in general, entertained them and looked after them as best he could. Uncle Vanya and a couple of women from the village whom he organized himself fed the visitors for a few rubles, gladdening the stomachs and hearts of the guests. For everyone, from the rector to the students, he was simply Uncle Vanya. Burnt by the sun until he was black, very wiry and strong. A guy who knew the forest perfectly and loved it deeply. He was always interested in the kids' classes, looked through the microscopes enthusiastically, and clapped happily. Look at this. In general, he greatly supported the spirit of research and science. Everyone liked him. Everyone had a good time with him. Of course, in no one could he arouse the slightest suspicion of anything bad. Absolutely nothing. My closest friend was graduating from the university of that Siberian city, and, logically, knew Uncle Vanya very well. With a classmate from Novosibirsk, they had gone several times in winter too. Uncle Vanya guided them enthusiastically through the surrounding forests, flushing out partridges and moose, where in summer resonated the shouting of the busy student base. These two boys we are going to call Andrei and Valera. First, because they are named that in reality, and second, because they did not authorize me to give their surnames, so better to leave them without full names. The story itself began when Uncle Vanya got married. There is nothing strange about that in principle. It has nothing impossible about it, because Uncle Vanya was not old at all, and his wife was the widow of a forest ranger, who wasn't a child either. A woman with a male child of about 8 years old. In reality, at the base and at the university, no one knew anything about Uncle Vanya's private life. And the truth is that they didn't set themselves to think about it either. Uncle Vanya always walked alone, very dark-skinned, very much of the forest, very energetic, very much doing his own thing, and completely unimaginable in a family setting. For everyone, he was more a part of the base than an independent personality. At the beginning of this story, everything coincided. The boys arrived in winter at the base, and just then Uncle Vanya was getting married, and right there, everything jumped out. To begin with, they found out that this was not, by any stretch of the imagination, Uncle Vanya's first wife. Uncle Vanya spent his time marrying young women, but only with divorcees or widows, and always provided they had a male child, and for some reason, his wives didn't last very long alive. Hard to say why. And the stepsons, they asked. Those Uncle Vanya raises beautifully, they replied to him. Have you seen Kolya, the one with the tractor? That one is also Uncle Vanya's stepson, and Yegor, the beekeeper, him too. There the boys jumped from their chairs, because the beekeeper Yegor, who was also sitting at the party eating for three, and shouting, Gorko, the traditional Russian wedding toast, was already pushing his late 40s. How old was Uncle Vanya then? The boys began to ask Yegor when Uncle Vanya had married his mother. The festive atmosphere lent itself to chatting. And besides, the boys used to go to the hive to gather insects and plants, talked a lot with Yegor, and respected his experience. So the conversation flowed. And it was during the war. I am from the year 30, and I was 13 years old. Do the math. I remind you that the events of our story take place in 1977, so that information blew your mind. He was young back then. Well, young. With Uncle Vanya, you never know. He looks the same as now, and he had already married before that. With whom? Well, you didn't know her. The son of that first wife, Katya, passed away the year before last. And Katya? She died a long time ago, before the war. Go on. And how old was the son of that woman? Well, he beat me by about 15 years. I was a brat, and he already had his own field. As is known, if you want to know the past of people, you have to look for the oldest witnesses. In Russian villages, they are usually the grandmothers. Long-lived, active, who have known everyone forever. The boys knew the old women of the place. The atmosphere of the wedding, again, helped. Are you talking about Vasika? Oh, don't even tell me. Vasika fell. He climbed a pine tree drunk. I told him 100 times not to climb, but he climbed. He was old. But what are you saying, boys? If he was from the year 15, for you obvious that he was old. He could have lived 100 years more if he hadn't climbed that pine tree, and Uncle Vanya was his father. No, how is he going to be the father? He married Katyusha, may she rest in peace. Vasika was small. He was about 5 years old. And how old was Uncle Vanya at that time? Who knows? Who knows? The boys were going to hear a lot more times, but already with this, they were left frozen. Because if the son of the first wife was born more or less in 1915, and Uncle Vanya married the mother in 1920, it meant that Uncle Vanya, now in 1977, could not be less than 74 or 75 years old. And most likely he was considerably older. Things that happen. A lot of people went to the party. There was no room in the houses, so the boys went back to the base to rest and think a bit alone before having to spend a second whole day eating, drinking, and celebrating. That night, tucked into their sleeping bags, the boys smoked non-stop and calculated what was going on with Uncle Vanya. As usually happens in these cases, it was as if a veil fell from their eyes. And they began to notice other very strange things. For example, that Uncle Vanya was well known by the emeritus, professors who had started working before the war, some 40 or 50 years ago. Even Uncle Boda, the patriarch and living legend of the biology faculty, greeted Uncle Vanya shaking hands and would start remembering with him the fishing trips of the 40s. The stove purred quietly. The logs crackled, and outside the sky had filled with stars. A freezing cold was approaching. A known, beloved, and quite cozy world. But the boys couldn't sleep. They turned the matter over and over, debating the mystery, and both understood that if they let Uncle Vansanya's secret pass, they weren't going to have peace even with themselves. What do? Do we interrogate Uncle Vanya? We interrogate him. Tomorrow we ask in the village to see who knows what. Yes, in the middle of the celebration it's going to be easy. And then, in the city we have to check the file. He has to have his age listed in the Human Resources Department at least. Totally. 2 days more, Andre and Valera went around finding out through the village. It jumped out immediately that Uncle Vanya always got married the same way. With a young and single woman, divorced, abandoned, or a widow, and always with a male child from the first marriage. He always organized a wedding in style, and no one doubted the status of his wife. But he never registered the marriage in a legal way. The truth is that there was no need either, because however much he married, he never had children of his own. The first effect of the marriage was obvious immediately. The woman bloomed like a rose, but the curious thing was that no one had any idea what living with Uncle Vanya was like. However much the bride's friends tried to worm information out of her, no one managed to know why Uncle Vanya was such a good husband. Only the external result was seen. What was inside remained closed to outsiders. The second point was even stranger. The thing is that each autumn, at the end of August or in September, Uncle Vanya would head deep into the taiga, the dense Siberian forest. He didn't go to gather pine nuts or mushrooms, nor did he go to hunt. He just left, and that was it. He took a piece of bread and went in without weapons, without provisions, without matches. If at that moment his adopted son was still small and hadn't grown up, he took him with him. They went deep into the taiga for 1 or 2 weeks. What did they do in the forest? What did they eat? What did they drink? Where did they sleep? No one knew, because neither Uncle Vanya nor the child said a word upon returning. And what did you eat, son? And what there was around? Oh yeah, and what did you see? The striking thing was that the boy never told anything about those walks with Uncle Vanya. Not when small, nor when he grew older, nor to friends, nor to the wife, nor to anyone burdened with the secret. The boys barely went to the forest, and when they went, they only talked about Uncle Vanya. Upon returning to the city, the agenda included talking to the old professor, Uncle Boda, and investigating in the personnel department. Uncle Boda started remembering delighted all the hunting and fishing anecdotes of different eras. Go on, and did he change much since then? They asked him. And, look boys. Uncle Boda opened his hands disconcerted, and it was noted that it was the first time he realized, thinking about it, it's as if nothing had changed. Go on, and will it be possible to get photos from that time? But of course, come to the house, we'll look at the photos and remember old times. Uncle Boda remembered long and thoroughly, with pleasure. He told a lot of interesting details while inviting them to a tea with herbs and forest fruits that he himself gathered and drew. The only issue was that the photos did not appear. That is to say, Uncle Vanya did not appear in any. Everyone who went to the field took souvenir photos. There were a lot, even ancient glass plates. But Uncle Vanya, for some reason, was never caught. How strange. I remember perfectly having spent a whole roll taking photos of him with how photogenic he is. The roll did not appear. In a photo where supposedly Uncle Vanya was, he just happened to be crouching. In another, he had turned around. In a third, it seemed to be him. But on the photographic paper, a diffuse blur of light was seen, right covering Uncle Vanya's face. Look what bad luck. for the paper to spoil right in that place. And the negative, there was no negative, know where it had gotten to. In short, Uncle Boda could not find a single photo of Uncle Vanya in his huge collection. Well, let's search in the personnel department. But there jumped out an even more mysterious detail. In the office, they remembered that Uncle Vanya appeared working at the university since the year 1920. It was a real fact. He was considered a Labour veteran. They sent him congratulatory cards for May 1st and November 7th. They invited him to solemn events, and Uncle Vanya, with the same regularity, never went. The photo of Uncle Vanya in the personal file directly wasn't there. One might think that at that time it wasn't mandatory to stick the photo in the file, and that's why they didn't put it. But first, it was mandatory, and they were put, even if there were exceptions. Second, to those who had entered before and hadn't had it put, they added it later. Why with Uncle Vanya did it never happen? Third, neither in the file nor on any payroll sheet was there a single signature in Uncle Vanya's own handwriting. Why? In the original file, the area chief signed. At that time it was allowed, and since then the file hadn't been touched. It stayed stored there. Go on, and the pay receipts? And that custom had formed. Uncle Vanya didn't usually collect on payday. They kept the money for him, and another signed for him. There were never problems. There were never complaints. Everything tallied. Go on, and since when did that custom come? We don't even know. Since a long time ago, when we entered to work, it was already like that. In Uncle Vanya's yellowish file appeared some curious annotations that said, Deckel, per choose. That is to say, the data had not been settled based on documents, but by personal declarations, by word of mouth. Ivan Ivanovich Ivanov, according to personal declaration, born in 1895 in the village of Bolshoy Ugor, according to personal declaration, did not form part, was not affiliated, has no record, non-partisan parents, field workers without horses, sympathizers of the cause, all based solely on his word. In the file, there was also a certificate, a page torn from somewhere, put together by hand by someone not very educated, with lines crooked like snakes. Upon those lines, with an old and hurried calligraphy, full of spelling mistakes, it was stated that, in the village of Bolshoy Ugor, the church caught fire, burned by imperialist saboteurs. Therefore, there is no possibility to verify the data provided by Ivanov, but neither is there need, since Ivanov's proletarian origin is obvious, and he can be hired. The irony of the situation was that the church of Bolshoy Ugor remained standing just as it was in the present, and that the parish books of that area had not been burned by imperialist saboteurs in 1919, but by the communists themselves in 1934, when all over Russia temples were closed and records destroyed at the request of workers' assemblies. It means that in 1920 there was not the slightest difficulty to verify any data of a person born in Bolshoy Ugor, and of course, not even the church books were needed to find out if an Ivanov family lived in the village and where they came from, calling things by their name. In 1920, an absolute stranger had joined the university base to work. Ivanov, or perhaps not Ivanov, from Ugor, or perhaps not from Ugor, born in 1895, or perhaps not in 1895, human or non-human. He got married but had no children, and not a single photo. What that which lived at the base and figured as a watchman, the cigarette smoke floated dense in the air of the room. The friends thought and rethought. They remembered everything related to Uncle Vanya. Uncle Vanya was never bitten by anything. Neither dogs bit him, nor cats scratched him, nor mosquitoes bit him. It's true that people who spend a lot of time in the forest are bitten less by mosquitoes than novices, it's a fact. But for them directly not to approach him, that doesn't happen anymore. Uncle Vanya remained an exception to all rules. Amid laughter and with much respect, the local people had told them once that Uncle Vanya pointed out a small light spot on a distant slope, a dwelling deer. With binoculars, one could barely manage to distinguish that it was a large male going down through the ravine. "It has 11 points on the antlers," Uncle Vanya said at that moment. A few hours later, when they hunted the animal, he turned out to be right. The points were 11. Well, 12 counting a small one. Uncle Vanya smoked like a chimney, but had a fantastic sense of smell. He sensed the smell of mushrooms from several meters away. And all this with supposed 83 years. And what aim for fishing? Andrei caught 3 fish, Valera 5, and Uncle Vanya died laughing, while unhooking the 23rd. But he always fished just right, never too much. It was as if he knew beforehand how much he was going to catch. He went to the forest without food. There, I get it. You have to have tremendous confidence to know exactly what you are going to find in the forest, how much and when. He was gifted. Everything turned out well for him, even on the first attempt. He had never driven a car. One day it was needed. He got in and drove. It's true he didn't like it. On horse is better, he said, but he drove. He had never played chess, only checkers. They showed him what the rules were like. He sat at the board and, after a short time, he started beating everyone. He walked through the forest without making a single noise. The boys, who were good walkers, strong and hunters, could only envy Uncle Vanya. He appeared always. Suddenly, out of nowhere, showed you something interesting and disappeared with the same quickness. Not a branch moved, not a stick crackled. And yes, seriously, the mosquitoes didn't bite him. Near 3 a.m, Andrei cleared the smoke with his hand and threw out a delusional question. "Hey, have you ever seen Uncle Vanya's back?" The question sounded like pure schizophrenia. There was no doubt, because there is only one creature whose back cannot be seen according to Russian legends. The Leshy, the spirit of the forest. Valera sat up suddenly in bed, tense. "No," he said with a choked voice. "No, I haven't seen it." And neither of the two could remember having ever seen Uncle Vanya's back. It's true, he walked around without a shirt when he cut the grass or chopped wood, but they always saw him from the front or from the side. Perhaps they had seen it from behind and had forgotten. Perhaps the months passed with the complicated life of final year students. Both were writing their thesis. Only in July, after sitting the final exams, could they return to the base, already with the degree under their arm. The thing is that the doubt had matured during those 6 months, and the boys already knew what they were going to do and how. Uncle Vanya looked towards here. Uncle Vanya turned around, and Valera shot instantly with his Zenit camera. Valera knew he had done everything right. The boy was an excellent photographer, and it was impossible for it to turn out badly. The bad thing was that, right after the click, Valera crossed eyes with Uncle Vanya for an instant. Uncle Vanya narrowed his eyes, barely a fraction of a second. But much Valera afterwards tried to take it as a joke and said he wanted to have a souvenir. He was ready to swear that Uncle Vanya knew perfectly what they were plotting and for what. They continued taking photos of the base, of how Uncle Vanya chopped wood, of the dog Umka, of the horse Grey. But on the night of that same day, Valera, out of pure clumsiness, overexposed the whole roll of photos. He thought he had already rewound the film and opened the camera lid. It turned out he hadn't rewound anything, and the photos were lost. The next day, they got up later and headed towards where Uncle Vanya was scything the meadow. With the binoculars, he could be seen well, even from behind, but blurry. From the hot pasture rose dense waves of air due to the heat, causing Uncle Vanya's figure to look distorted. The boys quickened their pace. Both were athletes, strong hunters. They moved fast and without making noise. It seemed a ridicule to go wanting to ambush an old man who cut the grass peacefully on his own land. But when they came out to the clearing where Uncle Vanya was, the guy had already put his shirt on. Well, let's do one thing. From the meadow, leave 2 paths towards the base. Put yourself on that one, and I on this one. He usually walks back with his shirt over his shoulder. You already saw him. That way, there's no way he passes by without us seeing his back. Near 10 at night, devoured by mosquitoes and extremely tired from the uncomfortable posture, Andre almost died of fright. Someone placed a hand on his shoulder suddenly. Share a cigarette with me, Uncle Vanya had approached without making a sound, and on top of that from an unexpected direction. Because he didn't come by the path, rather he came straight out from the thick of the forest. Will he have known that Andre was waiting for him? Uncle Vanya laughed low, as always, and started telling a story of the forest. Something about some ants who didn't like caterpillars, falling into the anthill, and had stood to besiege the whole tree. Andre gave him a pack of Astra cigarettes, and in the blink of an eye, was left alone. Only then did he realize that Uncle Vanya hadn't even asked him what he was doing sitting there, crouching, and without taking his eyes off the path. That is, he knew it. In a quite bad mood, Andre went down to the base and crossed paths with Valera. Valerica, it seems to me he has realized everything. He has appeared to me just now from the middle of the forest to ask me for a smoke. To you? But if he was just now with me. With you? Yes, he appeared next to me and asked me for a cigarette. Valera, with me he was too. For half a minute, the boys stayed looking at each other like idiots, and then turned their heads at the same time to look for Uncle Vanya. Uncle Vanya was over there, completely alone. He dedicated himself to a task of the most normal, chopping wood, and wore his shirt on as corresponds to an older man on a Siberian afternoon. In appearance, he looked 45 years old at most. Even without being able to get closer to Uncle Vanya, the boys were incapable of letting go of the mystery. They walked around the base, smoked, and had long talks that the others didn't understand. People began to look at them with respect as young scientists fully into the high concepts of science. Shortly after, Andre went to the village to look for provisions, loaded his backpack to the top, and headed back towards the base by the dirt forest road. He walked calmly. What are 7 kilometers for a young and healthy boy, even with a heavy backpack? It was getting dark. In the violet-colored sky peeked the first stars, when behind, passing the curve of the road, a clear noise was heard. They seemed like steps, or the blow against the earth of a giant palm. What was that? Again the same blow but closer, and absolutely nothing was seen. At the third blow, it seemed to distinguish the silhouette of something huge and invisible advancing. To Andre's credit, not for a second did he doubt that this situation was a greeting from Uncle Vanya. The question was, what kind of greeting? What was he supposed to do? Andre stopped at one side of the road and smoked 2 cigarettes in a row. No noises were heard behind, only the darkness. Denser, under the trees, the shadows that stretched covering. Also the road. Andre walked again and instantly felt that behind someone took a step, or a jump, or a blow against the earth, closer each time, causing his heart to rise to his mouth. In a few minutes came the last curve of the road, and there was almost no light. The dull thuds against the floor were heard on top, so much that the earth vibrated, and the impact was felt in the soles of his feet. What was left for him to do? Andre clenched his teeth and walked as straight as possible down the middle of the road. The noises of the jumps were felt stuck to his back, and to the blows was added an agitated and heavy breathing. The last jump fell right behind Andre, and something warm brushed his shoulder, along with a very well-known sound, which had nothing to do with danger. Something like a neigh. Behind him, almost leaning on his back and shaking its head, was Uncle Vanya's horse, Grey. The horse walked loose, grazing, saw an acquaintance, and approached. Trying to dominate the trembling of his knees, Andre stroked the animal's neck, scratched its forehead, and shared a piece of the bread from his backpack. But why wasn't Grey seen before? Besides, the sound had been too loud, abnormally sharp. Completely in the dark arrived Andre at the base, trying to recover from the fright. And what happens? In the corral next to Uncle Vanya's house was Grey trampling the ground. He saw Andre, raised his head, and threw a neigh in his direction. Andre didn't feel like returning to the curve to check what it was he had left behind. That night the friends talked almost until dawn about Uncle Vanya, about what other little greetings they could expect from him in the near future, and about who could help them unveil such a mystery. But once they were far from there, the next day the boys left the base. Not forever, but they knew that for a long time. They went to the places where they had to work the next few years. Uncle Vanya said goodbye to them. They greeted each other with a handshake. Andre confessed later that he had a huge temptation to look fixedly into those dark eyes and ask him, "I won't tell anyone, but confess, Uncle Vanya, you are the Leshy, right?" But Andre did not yield to the temptation. All this happened in July, and at the end of September of that same year, 1978, Uncle Vanya disappeared. No, he didn't resign. He didn't ask for a transfer. He didn't retire nor move. He simply disappeared. He diluted. One fine day, he lifted his wife and his adopted son onto the cart and made a sign to Grey. The neighbors didn't even manage to understand what was happening. Will the Ivanovs have gone for a ride? But the cart continued its journey. Grey moved his ears and trotted. The axles of the cart creaked, the wheels turned, and the carriage moved through the paths of the taiga, swaying among the yellow leaves of the poplars and the birches of the ditch, and the yellow and red forests kept passing, the harvested fields, the dark blocks of September afternoons in Siberia. I don't know from where those people left, and I don't have the slightest idea of where they arrived in the end. And of course, I don't know who Uncle Vanya really was, whether the Ivan Ivanovich Ivanov born in Bolshoi Ugor in 1895, or a completely different creature. If Andre and Valera's suspicion is true, Uncle Vanya is probably raising a new adopted son now. I wonder what year of birth he will have had noted down this time, according to his personal declaration. Life was of the most normal. I finished the institute. I graduated. I got a good job. Then I met Aliona, and we got married. Everything was beautiful, truly, like in a fairy tale. At 1.5 years, our daughter, Mashinka, was born. When Masha turned 5, Aliona decided to go visit a classmate from school who had settled in the south with her husband after college. She lived insisting for Aliona to go visit. Aliona never arrived. The bus plunged down a ravine 70 meters deep. Of the 50 passengers, only 4 survived. My wife was not among them. I didn't want to live. I wanted to climb the walls. I gave hard to drink. But I came through. For Masha, I came through. It was extremely hard without Aliona, as if a piece of body had been torn from me, and I had been left bleeding out, even after the identification of the body and the burial. I kept waiting for it to have been a mistake, that they had buried another woman, that at any moment they would call me from the hospital to tell me that my wife had reacted. and that she was calling her husband and her daughter a fool. I had to learn to do a lot of things: wash, iron, clean. I learned to cook. I changed jobs. I sent my professional career to hell. Masha had been left without a mom, and I couldn't act any other way. And so started our life of two. We adapted, we found the trick to it, and we even started having a good time. The thing is that sometimes the slump came over me. You were there in the kitchen, cooking a stew that was burning on you, and you stayed waiting to hear Alyonka's voice. "But where are you looking, you big fool? Lower the fire, pour a little drizzle of oil." And that her loving hands would take the damn pan from you. A knot formed in my throat that made me want to hang myself. My daughter sensed those moments instantly. She left her toys, approached me, and hugged me in silence, stroking me with her little hands. And then, when Mashenka turned 9 years old, they gave her the diagnosis: aggressive osteosarcoma. In the best of scenarios, they didn't give her more than a year of life. Yes, the disease hadn't manifested during a very long time. And when we went to the doctor, it was already late. They found metastases in her lungs and in her brain. I had already gone through the loss of my wife. If Masha died, I no longer had reasons to keep living. I drove the family doctor crazy. Masha had already been admitted to the oncology wing. I wrote letters of complaint to the Ministry of Health, to the prosecutor's office, to the president. I was ready to sell the car and the flat. The money reached me just right for an experimental treatment in Israel. One day, visiting Masha at the hospital, the chief of the oncology wing invited me to his office. He made me sit in an armchair, poured me cognac into a short glass, and planted it in my hand. He sat opposite and, looking at me fixedly into the eyes, told me, "The girl is leaving us. She has weeks left. Everything necessary, so that she doesn't suffer, we can give her here in our ward. It's not going to change anything. No treatment can change the outcome at this stage. Understand? The only thing it will do is fill your daughter's last days with pain and suffering. The choice is yours. Either pain and then death, or you spend this time peaceful together and you can say goodbye." I left that office completely empty of hope. I went down to Masha's room, but she was sleeping with the IV after another terrible pain crisis. The next morning I went to the church that is near the house. My parents had baptized me as a child, but I wasn't a believer. I didn't go to church, and I had no idea of the customs or the rituals. When I entered under those very high roofs, I felt as if all my problems and fears had stayed outside, that everything was going to be fine. I spent a couple of minutes walking with respect through the place, looking at the faces of the saints darkened by the passage of time. My gaze stopped at one icon in particular. On the board was drawn an old man with a white beard and hair. In one hand he had a long spoon with a cross on top, and with the other he held the bottom of a little box divided in the middle. "That is Saint Diomedes," a whisper was heard behind my back. "The great martyr. By profession he was a doctor, but he cured not only with the remedies but also with the word of God." I turned around and saw an old woman, skinny and faded, with a grey apron, a grey headscarf over her grey hair, and a wrinkled face with her mouth tightened in a gesture of sorrow. The wide-open eyes of the old woman were dark and had a touch of madness, although I could well have confused madness with the fire of true faith. I nodded with my head, and the old woman continued, "If you have someone sick, pray to Diomedes, put a candle for their health. The little candle is 200 rubles. The little list with the name for the priest, 500. After those words, it was as if a blindfold fell from my eyes and my mind. I looked around and no longer felt anything similar to respect or devotion. I was in a very old building with high roofs that crushed you, surrounded by a lot of cracked and dark woods with faces of people who perhaps hadn't even existed, completely perturbed and as if a bucket of cold water had been thrown on me, I turned around and almost went running out. My legs carried me straight to the nearest supermarket, from where I brought home an important quantity of alcohol. Yes, I tried to drown the sorrow and the suffering in drink. I didn't even bother to buy some food to snack on. I got drunk instantly, and the following hours I remember them in patches. First, I simply drank. Afterwards, the pain and the sorrow that boiled inside me began to come to the surface like a river of words without sense. I drank and cried. I drank and cursed everyone and everything around me. I drank and shouted the dirtiest swear words that came to my mind. Afterwards, I began to beg. I don't remember what I said exactly, but I felt that those words came from the deepest part of my being. I begged for what I most desired in the world. I begged, I don't know whom, for my daughter to live. Take me if you want, whole or in pieces, cried my soul. As long as she lives, tear off my arms, my legs, whatever. For that moment, I could no longer walk or crawl, so I stayed writhing on the hallway floor, bathed in tears and vomit. Afterwards, I remember the noise of the entrance door slamming against the wardrobe, and of the darkness that flooded the flat. I felt a terrible cold, and I began to clear up, and straight after, a wild primitive terror invaded me. The only thing I could do was flatten myself face down against the filthy floor, sticking my cheek against my own vomit. A part of my being, the one that wasn't paralyzed by fear, shrieked with a desperate internal little voice. They heard you. They came to take what was promised. Don't look. For whatever you love most, don't look, don't look. I listened to the little voice and closed my eyes tightly to the point that it hurt. At first, there was silence. Afterwards, a slight scratching was heard. A little noise like claws on the floor. That's how some moved. A sibilant breathing was felt, a viscous click and wet steps. And that's how others moved, steps of barefoot human feet. But strange, as if the owner had more than two legs. That's how the third walked. There were a lot of different things there in the darkness around me, and afterwards, I felt them touching me, some light, careful touches, but rough, and that stung a little bit. I don't know what they were touching me with, but they weren't hands. Those touches traveled over my whole body, my head, my arms, my legs, jumping from one side to another, without order and repeating themselves. Finally, they stayed fixed on my right arm, which was stretched to the side of my body. Afterwards, the arm was flooded with a cold that covered it from the tips of the fingers to the middle of the shoulder. I felt an enormous pressure. At the following second, in the part where there was no cold, a sharp pain exploded and I lost consciousness. I woke up in my bed. The sun hit me in the face through the open curtains. I had a mouth like sandpaper and my tongue pasty. I had nausea and felt my head as if I had a bowling ball inside that rolled at the least movement. My God, what a way to drink yesterday. What a disaster. Well, I have to get well right now to go running to the hospital to see Mashar. Upon thinking about my daughter, my heart shrank and tears came to me. Strength. You have to endure. I tried to get up from bed, lowered my legs to the cold floor, leaned a bit forward to lift my body, and went headfirst due to the weight of the tremendous hangover. By reflex, I stretched my right arm to lean on the nightstand, but the arm passed right through and I took a side fall against the floor, hitting my shoulder against the corner of the furniture. It hurt so much that I cried from the pain. I stayed sitting on the floor, leaning my back against the bed, holding my hit shoulder with my left hand, and trying to wipe the tears from my eyes with my right hand, and I couldn't, because there was no hand, because the right arm ended in a smooth and absurd stump, some 21 centimeters below the shoulder joint. And there I remembered everything that had happened the previous night, with a millimetric level of detail. The darkness, entering through the door, the primitive terror that froze me, the noises that filled the room, the touches that recoiled, the cold that covered my right arm, and the sting of pain. I remembered everything almost textually, almost because I couldn't recover in memory the exact words with which I had begged for help. From that plea only remained the sensation of an infected wound that had finally burst. It means that my request had been heard. Now, had it been fulfilled? Well, soon I was going to know, with a lot of effort, swearing in Aramaic under my breath and, at times, crying from helplessness. I managed to make myself more or less presentable in the hallway. By the way, there remained no trace of what happened the previous night, although the kitchen did keep the prints of the lack of control. When I went to dress, I found myself with an impactful surprise. My entire wardrobe was carefully adapted to my new one-armed physiognomy. The long sleeves of the sweaters, shirts, and jackets were sewn, folded, or pinned with safety pins right at the height of the stump. The clothes, with buttons impossible to manage with a single hand, had moved to the back of the wardrobe. On the front shelves, there were clothes with snap fasteners, zippers, or directly without openings. The shoes with laces had left their place to practical sneakers with Velcro or with elastics at the sides. Finishing with the clothes, I stretched my hand to grab the car keys, but I stopped at the last moment. With the manual gearbox, I wasn't going to be able to. Managing the keys with clumsiness, I opened the flat door and crossed paths with the neighbor from opposite, an older, talkative, and quite nice woman. I was ready for any question and any reaction, but not for this. The neighbor looked out of the corner of her eye at the sleeve of my jacket with a look of pity but not at all surprised, greeted me kind, asked me about Mashenka's health, made a comment about the weather, and, after listening to my short answers, tucked herself into her flat. About the arm, not a word, as if it were the most normal thing in the world. A taciturn and serious taxi driver carried me straight to the main entrance of the hospital without making questions. Within a minute, I was already in my daughter's room. Barely did I see her smile, and her bright eyes. I understood it. She was healthy. My legs gave way, and I fell sitting on the edge of the bed. Afterwards, we cried, we laughed again, and I hugged Masha clumsily with my only arm. Afterwards, I heard in the background the hesitant monologue of the doctor talking about a miraculous remission, a unique case, and the typical things that doctors say when they don't know what to say. Afterwards, I signed some discharge papers. Afterwards, we walked down the hallway towards the elevator. With my left hand, I carried the bag with the things, and from my folded right sleeve hung Masha, still weak but happy, and we returned home. 1.5 years has passed. My Masha recovered completely. I already learned almost to manage without an arm. I work remotely from home, write articles, do editing of texts. Furthermore, I collect a pension for disability that figures processed. 4 years ago, the neighbors and acquaintances are not surprised to see me without the arm. But if I ask them directly how I lost it, they begin to beat around the bush, change the subject, or tell me any piece of nonsense. That it was amputated because a car ran over me, that it was due to an accident in a factory, due to an infection, and a lot of believable lies. Masha knows where my arm went to stop, the day we returned from the hospital. I tried to explain something to her, but my daughter pressed her little finger against my lips and told me low, "Dad, don't invent anything." I understood it all that same morning when I woke up. And so we live. I with my stump and my Masha, who is my son. Everything adjusted itself. I am thinking about buying myself an automatic car to replace the old one, but there is a single thing that doesn't let me sleep. My arm. Won't it have been too cheap a payment? And what happens if this was only the advance payment? And one day they are going to come to look for the rest?